Hmm. Well, thank you for the suggestion, Richard. I will definitely give it thought. I did have my half-year sabbatical, but that was, the purpose of that was to get caught up to cover all the novels. I've done all of them except Emma, and that's been covered really well by a woman in the 80s, a Gerardian, what was her name? Beatrice Marie. But I'm sorry, I talk in these when I come here when I should shut up because Roman wants to start something. So, but thank you, Richard.
It's quite neat to see people, so many people from Japan. It's the middle of the night, eh? Or it's not, or maybe it's not quite midnight yet, or is it?
No, it's only 10:30.
Really?
But last night I stayed till 3:30 a.m. I'm kind of getting used to it. The first night was tough, and now I'm turning into a GA night owl. So
there you go.
we're addictive.
you are indeed.
Yeah, I forgot. Yeah, this session starts so much earlier, so no, it's not quite so bad, I guess.
You know, I had a funny thought because I thought, you know, Ian debating Chris with Adam debating is kind of like William Buckley debating Irving Kristol with Eldridge Cleaver moderating. You know, it's like shouldn't Adam be debating Chris instead of you, and you moderating? It's like, how did you guys decide on this? Oh, you weren't supposed to hear
it was a sinister plot. It's really quite simple. By getting him to moderate, then he has to be moderate.
That's what I was thinking. It was a deferral of some kind of deferral thing. Sorry, you weren't supposed to hear that, Chris.
I didn't, but I'd like to now.
Never mind.
Now, do we want to give people a couple of more minutes to get here because it's very early on the west coast of North America? Or
what's the time there?
Well,
it's 6:30 on the west coast.
Right.
Which I assume is why Eric isn't here yet.
Yeah.
I know Andrew and Richard are here, which is, we thank you. That's cool.
Hello, everybody. All right, we have a very special session now. It's a debate, so please start when you think it's the right time to start. Adam, please take the microphone to you, and hello to Ian and Chris. Chris, where are you?
I'm here.
Hi, Chris. I'm sorry. Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
So guys, let's
Okay,
get
yeah.
started. All right.
Here we go. These two contestants, combatants, whatever, don't really need any introduction, but I'll give a brief one anyway. For maybe a couple of people who don't know both of them. Ian Dennis is a professor of English at the University of Ottawa and Secretary Treasurer of the Generative Anthropology Society and Conference. He's the author of 4 published novels of the Gerardian study, Nationalism and Desire in Early Historical Fiction, and of Lord Byron and the History of Desire, a work of literary criticism making use of both mimetic theory and generative anthropology, and which all of us should have read, by the way. I'll just kind of interject that. He was the chief organizer of the 2009 GA conference in Ottawa and co-organizer in 2013 at UCLA and 2019 in New York City. He's currently working on a book of GA theory, tentatively titled Varieties of Aesthetic Experiences, from which, okay, now I'll leave that last part out because I took that from the benchmarks. So tentatively entitled Varieties of Aesthetic Experience. Sorry about that. Chris Fleming is an associate professor in the School of Humanities and Communication Arts at Western Sydney University, where he's also a member of the Writing and Society Research Center. He's the author or editor of 10 books, including On Drugs, Does Religion Cause Violence, Rene Girard, Violence and Mimesis, and Modern Conspiracy, The Importance of Being Paranoid. He's a long-term contributor to Anthropologics and has written widely and with varying quality, although I don't know if I feel I feel like I don't want to quite repeat that, but I already did, on literature, philosophy, and culture. So the two of you have arranged exactly how to conduct this, I assume, so I'll just turn it over to you.
Thanks very much,
Adam. All right, so this may go for a while, so we can anyway. I'm going to leave it to Ian whether we stop or keep going. But anyway, this is a partially scripted, partly improvised thing. So it's a slightly, we'd structure it, but we'll read this, but hopefully it's still conversation. It's a report of an actual dialogue. So anyway, we had no Plato, so we had to do this ourselves. So hi, Ian, I'm pleased to be having this chat. I'm under no illusions, of course, that we agree or will agree on everything. Let's hope not. It's listed in the program as a debate. Thank God. You and I have engaged on and off over many years, and I realize talking to you always puts me at risk of learning. I'm wondering how we might explore the possibilities of GA helping us to think through contemporary politics, and in particular, political polarization. I think this is a decent starting point and not a particularly contentious one, is it? I don't actually need to make the case that polarization is a bad thing, do I? Not per se, it's not a bad thing in all areas of life. Polarization is what electrodes do, for instance. And to have polarization operating among boxes, for instance, shouldn't be a matter of concern. I am by nature a bit of a brawler, but maybe there's a less Australian and more Canadian approach here, to be reductive about it. I'm interested in offering alternative heuristic possibilities, not in order to correct GA, but to enlarge it. That sounds rather too grand. What do you think?
Hi, Chris. Yeah, it's great. And I'm intending and hoping to learn as well. I'm certain I will. I'm eager also to disagree. I've got Steven Pinker in my back pocket. Who knows, though, maybe we can persuade each other of one or two things. Yes, we both feel, suspect, that originary thinking offers some tools for analyzing contemporary politics that have so far been, shall we say, not fully developed, or not to all the purposes they might be.
Good. And what about polarization? Can we relate polarization in some way to the originary scene?
I think it's a feature of a later stage, after the decline of the power of the singular public center. There's only one polarization on the first scene between a single center and its periphery.
But mightn't you argue that this is some kind of spatial polarization, merely some kind of spatial polarization? I could imagine someone might argue that what we're referring to here might be couched in terms of the emergence of firstness, or maybe the question of firstness can wait.
Yeah, sure, okay. The heuristic will still help afterwards, though, when resentment around the periphery starts targeting rival, if sometimes only ostensible, claims upon centrality. Is such polarization bad? Definitely. I would describe it as a heightened mutual resentment that, like Girard's metaphysical desire, has become untethered from practical objects of desire and is leaving the world of facts, risks, and benefits behind. But I would distinguish it, as Girard does metaphysical desire as Girard does metaphysical desire from object desire. I would distinguish it from the lower voltage kinds of resentment that remain focused on definable centralities and desires, and are at least in principle attainable. Resentment in itself is not so much bad as dangerous. It leads to or risks violence. Yet human progress has been driven by the always risky but finally productive emancipation of both desire and its shadow side, resentment.
So you're moving, to my mind, pretty fast here. The emancipation of desire is a phrase that might easily fit with the pamphlet for a free love cult or the advertisement for a yacht. An example or two might help me.
Okay, let's say the arrogation of the center by the big man leads to models of vast liberation of human desire and creativity, one free first and finally all free. The resultant progress is realized not only by that conquest of the center in itself, but by the subsequent resentment of it and the redistributions those resentments impel.
Is this a variation of what might be dubbed the Rhino-Rio theory of progress, or more politely as trickle down? So you mean the guy with the biggest shoulders decides to dance in front of everyone and so get the girl, and the resentment directed towards dance guy produces a rash of globally sexy, agile dancing so that dancing standards rise globally? In what sense is this a liberation of desire? I realize my example stacks the deck somewhat. So might we say that instead microchips got better because of competitor microchips, and that the maker of the best microchips got the most money, but everyone maybe benefited from this because now we can all access porn at a rate and quantity undreamed of by our ancestors. So this is progress. This is maybe one of our face of our pinker disagreements.
Big man in Stalin's model redistributes. Those who concede the center to him, who don't act on the resentment of his usurpation, do so because they get more, firstly from his hand, but ultimately and more crucially through his modeling. Without that modeling, the sacred interdiction of the archaic center continues to prevail over every desire, which makes for egalitarian stagnation, something that, as you know, has popped up now and again over the ages. But their patience with that usurpation will not be infinite. This is an example of how deferred reciprocity pragmatically operates, not through the unforced and indefinite generosity of those going first, but by the imitative and always potentially rivalrous desires of those following and the threats therein. The peace of any big or first man establishes, at any rate, never lasts.
Okay, good. So this would distinguish what you're saying from Smith's invisible hand. Smith's model of private vices becoming public goods implies a kind of stable state. But here you're bending things differently. Maybe it's closer to the Chinese model, a usurped center with wonderful economic outcomes.
I solemnly forswear all prophecy. Everything could change or go south tomorrow, but I will allow myself to wonder if the Chinese big man is going to last either. China didn't generate these economic outcomes under quite the kind of governance he has relapsed into. Actually, though, the archaic state is much closer to stable. It probably lasted for millennia. But finally, along did come the big men, instability ever since. And I'd say the hand is far from invisible, especially when it falters. People resent, they erect guillotines. But okay, let me not get too far ahead. Let's concede that, if not an originary opposition per se, Aussie brawling and Canadian deference have their purposes. You may struggle with a combative tendency, while we Canucks, at least outside a hockey rink, might fall victim to a too strong or too long prolonged hesitation to grab and devour, all the while prating of good table manners. So yes, how might we grapple usefully with any of these phenomena in GA terms?
There's a lot of work to do. I do think deferral has a place in culture and indeed what philosophers call moral psychology that needs to be developed. Any reformed drug addict or alcoholic needs deferral as an ethic. But this is another aspect of GA that really could be explored, but it's not our focus. So firstness, the big man is a usurper. He models the kind of firstness, no. But here again, we need to stop and see what such a claim amounts to. I suppose what needs to be said straight away is that firstness, when used in any empirical historical sense, is always a claim, even a kind of defense. Children invariably defend their claim on a toy or space as originary. I had it first, we were here first, I thought of it first, I wanted it first. Even in these quite straightforward cases, even if they were armed with stopwatches and journals, we're not looking at anything terribly straightforward. When it comes to culture more generally, things get far more complex, partly because culture always arrives in mixtures and not statues, to use one of Michel Serres' preferred oppositions. Judaic firstness, for instance, only emerges as a kind of absolute if we sideline Canaanite religions and Babylonian religions, especially in their monolitristic varieties, for instance. And this is even before we start to trouble the idea of the Judaic as some absolute beginning. We can point out this God of the Israelites isn't a unity. The Yahweh of J is not the same Yahweh as that of the Elohist or the Deuteronomist or the priestly writer. Harold Bloom has spent a lot of time discussing this, even if he perhaps goes to too much effort to show the internal complexities. But I don't think it's merely academic to point this out, or the expression of some desire on my part for complexity. Nor is it particularly debatable, and nor should it be particularly scandalous. The very intelligibility of any cultural form relies on continuities. Even the biggest revolutions or breakthroughs in science only ever transfigure the given, not create it ex nihilo. All this is obvious, isn't it?
I specialize in the obvious, or I know it when I see it anyway, so yes.
Of course, the originary scene might itself be different, but this is the constitution of culture, its inauguration. But once we move beyond this, another series of questions present themselves. My point isn't a nominalist one or even a deconstructive one. I don't think just anything can be said about anything. One can't say, you know, I thought I was studying the history of religions, but now I realize I was studying the structure of the atom. But my priority here is elsewhere. I want to ask what work claiming firstness attempts to do.
You're concerned about this.
I'm worried because it doesn't seem to me to be coherent, and not just in the literal sense of awarding temporal gold medals. I understand it's not just about a time trial, but we can get to that. I'm worried in part because it panders to those who would want to express their own resentment through their identification of the ostensible resentment in others. I was in a car accident once on my way to a funeral, and the woman who crashed into me was driving a shiny gold BMW like a fully blinged Kardashian lunar module. She didn't seem particularly apologetic, and so I remarked uncharitably that I was surprised that someone driving such an expensive car didn't allot more cash resources for driving lessons. Her response, "You're just jealous." She meant envious. Is it redundant to say here that I wasn't?
Yes, but I'm envious of an anecdote like that. People are never so transparent with me. You maybe bring it out in them.
The designation resentment, in other words, can be a displaced form of self-diagnosis. But putting aside these qualms about whether claims to any kind of absolute firstness is intellectually coherent, we can see how the argument is often deployed. In New Zealand, for instance, they're our enemies, brothers, there was a debate about whether the Maori were actually the first people, or whether there were, you guessed it, other people, including white people, there first before the Maori came and ate them all or did something completely barbaric. You can probably guess which side of the political spectrum these theorists came from. But let's try that out anyway. If we do want to run with a certain kind of firstness argument, then why wouldn't we want to posit that so much racism and resentment towards Indigenous peoples is prompted by their firstness? In Australia, there's enormous anxiety still about the fact that a collection of cultures existed here prior to European settlement, a fact that the fact that the Europeans did their best to deny both in law and in practice. Is this European resentment about Indigenous firstness? I'm cautious about the category in this sense, but if we do want to run with it, what would stop us here?
They're great questions. Sure, firstness is often claimed, even sometimes by practitioners of GA, but for GA, in principle, a firstness is to be identified by its scenic effects. Those that qualify are attended to, imitated, provoke desire and resentment. Then the questions become, where anti-Semitism persists, points about the Babylonians are beside the point, this one anyway. Then the questions become attended to and so forth by whom, how many, how did they respond, and for how long? Especially now, many are called, though few are chosen. And then, is the longer term result deferred reciprocity or not? Do those imitations and resentments finally return satisfaction, generate broader human flourishing, new firstnesses, new benefits, or not? How might either outcome be detected or measured? Yes, the further from the origin, the more complex the picture, but I think the point of originary thinking is to reduce complexity to better understand human fundamentals, then return to the living scenes with a stronger analytic. So to your questions about Aboriginal firstness, or maybe that's a bit redundant. In Canada, we say First Nations.
It's much better. I'm probably supposed to say that too.
We could ask if the GA heuristic helps us understand the obvious fear, resentment, and violence triggered by all human difference through history, especially racial and ethnic difference.
But we're often not offended by difference, are we? I mean, Girard says that sameness is perhaps even more disturbing, at least sometimes. And teaching undergraduates, every one of them wants to be different, at the same time as declaring that their difference is the cause of their persecution. There was even one student I had named Jean-Jacques. I'm sorry, I've interrupted you.
Right. Your undergraduates are romantics, poor things, but they will learn to temper their desires. And our capacity now to tolerate and even love ethnic differences, albeit still imperfect, is one of our finest achievements, I'd say. But Girard is also right. I suspect people used to experience ethnic difference as some kind of malignant parody. What was similar and provoking was not physical attributes, but symmetrical desires. Anyway, as a proponent of open market, omni, or multicentric society, I'm more inclined to start with a field of firstnesses, all generating their different centralities into different effects. Might this be how GA does sales mixtures? No more single public center, as once featured a statue of a big man with a pigeon on his head, even or especially in the global context. A winner-take-all approach feels outmoded, atavistic, very especially, as I think you're also saying, in the case of claims for the firstness of very large units, like religions or civilizations.
Sure, or otherwise it becomes simply Nietzscheanism. We praise conquerors simply for conquering. If a person can win a game of chess by setting the board on fire, then losers, a favoured appellation of a recent world leader, just got to suck that fire up and make room for the guy with the most kerosene. Don't like my pyrotechnics? You just hate losing, pal.
We should discipline the word first, requiring it always to specify first at what, first to do what. Firstness is no one's permanent identity or possession. This is my contribution to the wholesomely obvious. Anyway, most claims of hegemony are laced with and distorted by resentments, even in those who feel they have it or those who feel others do. And most are brutally imprecise, especially now. My version of the question then is, in the kind of world we now have, what powers, roles, functions, contributions, or whatever arise from the firstness of First Nations? And of course, what resentments are generated by that particular instance or claim of centrality? And how are they exacerbated, mitigated, or transcended?
So I'm happy with this plurality of firstnesses, but now it's looking like a kindergarten classroom where everyone gets a prize. And maybe it's also true, you're right about this, but part of me really wants to step back and push you a little about the fact that although firstness seems to name something akin to a gold medal in an Olympic sprint, about which little save performance-enhancing drugs can be contested, athletics, if nothing else, models a kind of justice rarely achieved outside it. Firstness, when it comes to culture, is a heavily contested field. We find this out when we try to do a history of any complex artifact. Where does the history of computing begin and when? With computation? So sure, many firstnesses, multiple beginnings, multiple strands of emergence. Where's that history lie? The filing cabinet, the desktop, the calculator, the Pascalian, the arithmometer, the Talkatum, ENIAC. Who invented the computer? You might want to come up with a name for a quiz show. Let's call this quiz show epistemology or Jeopardy historiography, but the computer is really a whole museum, a history of human understandings. Of course, we must judge firstness in terms of its scenic effects, but those effects will also include effects of the claim of firstness itself. And the resentment of others is also a claim which pollutes the scene, if you will, and not simply something we document. Making things more complicated, no doubt, is that one of the principal means by which resentment is expressed is by claiming just how resentful others are. I'm sorry to get stuck on this. Do you think this is a minor issue? Can we fold this in somehow? I don't want to detain us, but it seems utterly crucial to me. What do you think?
The point maybe is that these contestations taken together imply that firstness is a product finally of the scene itself, rather than merely or entirely the doing of an innovative individual or group. Firstness is not exactly a synonym for centrality, but it does imply a relocation or proliferation of centrality. And centers, of course, depend on peripheries and vice versa.
Okay, this sounds promising.
The scene repeats and replicates ever. It is perhaps experienced temporally as singular, as one can only really pay attention to, one can't pay attention to more than one thing at a time. But memory teaches us that it is no single place. At given moments, some human being or group of them may seem to occupy or claim its center, but GA allows us to see that it is only the geometry itself, the geometry of fully human desire mediated by the sign, that produces all experiences of centrality or firstness and all the benefits and dangers that follow from them. Only one thing, GA insists, really did come first, though, and that was the originary scene. Its geometry co-produced was coeval with the firstness of the sign. And no, we will never back down or acquiesce to claims by or for the chimps and bonobos. Here we stand or die. We can retreat no further. That said, what can GA's approach offer? Can the sound and fury of politics be better understood using our geometry? One of the reasons I wanted to do this with you, though it lures me perilously out of whatever little thicket of competency I might otherwise shelter in, is the feeling, as we say, that there's more that could be done with GA in the way of political analysis. Maybe, as perhaps you imply, part of the problem has exactly been the temptation to identify what we might call permanent firstnesses, sometimes rather defensively. Contra the Christian Gospels, the first will always have been the first, and the last, well, last, or at least second.
Yes, lol, as the kids would say.
Implied thereby is an injunction to certain factions that they ought to simply stop resenting.
Yes, and that we aren't resenting.
Which GA itself, of course, knows is impossible. We can no more stop it than we can stop desiring. However, as my favorite poet, Lord Byron, in his best poem, never tires of showing us, the more one denies or tries to stop it in oneself or others, the more power it gains. Conversely, the more one acknowledges its power, sees the geometry, the better able one is to manage it, to choose one's actions. This to me is also what GA offers.
Sadly, for a debate, I concur.
Desire cannot but be felt, but action upon desire is not inevitable. As with desire, so also with resentment. I actually share some of that resentment of the resenters you mentioned, but GA helps me plot the location both of theirs and mine, calculate the functions, project lines of perspective. Consequently, if we're talking politics, I would rather we put more of our thought and observation into processes, which work now to reduce violence and foster the operation of human productivity of every kind, which ones don't or don't any longer. How can we read the unfolding processes around us to determine when the rechanneling of resentment into productivity or love is starting to falter and risk failure and a collapse into a more than merely episodic violence? How might intensifying polarization, surely a symptom or stage of such faltering, be better understood as part of larger processes? And how might it be lessened?
So here I get hung up again on a term. Why productivity? Is there a better antonym to destructivity? And doesn't your rechanneling also employ alchemy and hydraulics? GA is turning out to be a very steampunk kind of science.
Well, it's the perspective of progress that dreams of producing things, states, conditions, improvements, as we, humanity, have done, progress and produce, improve. Would you rather I wave about the better angels of our nature or maybe enlightenment now? Really, my references to Pinker are really only references to the data he provides in the first part of the better angels of our nature. I think the rest of the book is not worth all that much. But it's just a short form for saying, yeah, there's been progress. We kill each other less than we used to per capita. You know, I've talked about this before. Anyway.
Yeah, I don't buy his figures. But anyway, yeah.
As to rechanneling, perhaps we do need a better metaphor. So no, anyway, it's not a minor issue. Can we develop a more productive use of the heuristic?
So if we're intending to debate, then this is not quite going to plan. There's a bit too much to endorse. First, this is a product of the originary scene, to which we maybe add and also constitutive of it, that it repeats, I'd say reiterates itself everywhere, that GA's geometry offers us perhaps or potentially something better, and on, and perhaps most importantly, that we will cede nothing to the bonobos. Let them eat bananas, I hear the ghost of someone say.
Anyway, fear not, we're still on methods and purposes. Moving to applications, I'm confident we'll be at each other's throats.
So I appreciate your point about the originary scene's originariness. That is, to put it more crassly, it was not preloaded with a feminist, a Marxist, and critical race theorist, all of whom somehow were inept and resentful, and who henceforth remarketed their ineptness and resentfulness, their weakness, Nietzsche would say, as strength. I'm obviously recalling here the genealogy of morals, where he leveled a parallel charge at Jews and Christians of turning defeat into a virtue, of a religious worldview fueled by resentment. So that from this time on, we can now only see the capacity for these religions to drain European greatness of its vim through self-hatred. Mind you, I'm not certain that someone mightn't actually opt for the hypothesis that there were at least proto-gender theorists, proto-race theorists, and proto-Marxists in attendance. But rather than paranoidly counter this possibility, I'll let it stay as a joke, the kind that would start a feminist, a Marxist, and a critical race theorist walked into an originary scene.
Next time we're actually able to have a beer together, I want to hear the rest of that joke. Ottawa in 2022. That was a plug.
One problem, as I see it, is that this sort of universal model doesn't fit well with those kinds of explanation currently in favour, both on the right and on the left, that we always know who the victims and who the perpetrators are before the fact. People who are attracted to a priori models will always be tempted to force the theory to seize empirical history in advance. But if yielded to, this would simply turn GA into another clientele-based theory, where we know, say, that anti-Semitism is the only real prejudice and that everything else is a power play based on special pleading, victimary thinking. Apart from anything else, this diminishes the minimality of the model. It's also wrong, but that's another issue. And further, it erodes what's potentially so interesting and helpful about GA, which is that it refuses, at least in theory, to avail itself of both the universal dispensation and the universal condemnation. Marxist race and gender theorist tends towards theoretical models predicated on the ontological innocence of their victims, their preferred victims. Judith Butler's support of Me Too couldn't help but run aground on the mere possibility that a woman, and a friend of hers, would or could ever assault anyone. And this incoherence was upheld by her supporters. I don't think this is unique to one person, by all accounts a brilliant and well-educated and interesting thinker. Rather, it's a kind of thinking that more metaphysical forms of thought will eventually lead us to. If we've decided that resentment is the sole province of one group of people, then we're involved in something quite far, as far as I'm concerned, from GA, I think. And we're also far from Girard's thinking, which shares with GA a parallel abstract minimality.
Yes, and we touched on Girard. Girard offers exactly the spectacle of enemy brothers, monstrous doubles. Firstness is irrelevant to that vision.
So the point is not that we must insist on some banal form of moral or anthropological equivalence, but that such a case, if it's to be made, must be made using all the painstaking tools of social science, discourse analysis, engram analysis, policy analysis, history, and so on. The joke about the philosopher is that he's a person who's confident he could reconstruct the causes of the First World War through a transcendental reflection on the ego. I wouldn't want this joke to be applied or to be applicable to GA. To me, one of the advantages of GA with respect to most political thinking is that it's scenic. I think the term geometry fits this well. Thinking in terms of center and margins offers a uniquely powerful heuristic for analyzing politics, among much else. But if one's adoption of this model is to either always know who is in these positions and who claims them and why people must be on, even be on such margins, then GA is no longer a heuristic, but what might be called an ideology. Does this connect with what you call permanent firstness? I'm concerned on setting up a straw man here, that people may well respond, we are using data, we are looking at history, we are doing discourse analysis. Or maybe one response would be to say, but the very structure of the left is originarily victimary. Being left means having both committed this original sin and henceforth being committed to it, a sin all leftists continue to carry both in their hearts and in their daily acts. One final objection is someone might say, Chris, this isn't going to help because history can always be interpreted in a way that simply conforms to the a priori / clientele model. To the person on the right who says, the left is always playing victim, the leftist might say, President Trump made more claims about his persecution than any president in living memory. Look at his speeches, look at his tweets, look at his press conferences. To which the person on the right will say, but he was a victim. Did you see Nancy Pelosi tear those pieces of paper to shreds? Then they'd quote Niemöller, first they came for the State of the Union addresses. Maybe my analysis doesn't offer us any solution at all. Help me here, give me something to hope in.
Careful what you wish for. I'll take your plea as permission to make that switch to applications and thus to things that you can better disagree with. And I did say there was a temptation to think of permanent firstnesses. Our task, even as we do disagree, is to try to lead ourselves and others out of it. So you mentioned Nietzsche and other eminences. I'm sure you're better acquainted with that bunch than I am. But let me summon up the ghost of the more recently departed Karl Popper and his open society. And I'll try to avoid the provocative consonantal slippage from Popper into Pinker, although it's a natural one. GA envisions post-originary history as a fouille en avant. Eric repeatedly returns to the expression, which the firstness necessitated, and every subsequent one still propels. The sign defers violence, but intensifies desire, producing more of the latter and threatening more of the former. a pragmatic problem ever and again to be solved, and making, as we were saying, the scene a shifting one, the half-lives of firstnesses ever dangerously in decay. Isn't there an affinity here with Popper's unending struggle that perhaps all human societies perform, but the open ones more efficiently, that struggle to solve the problems caused by the last set of solutions? More efficiently, maybe, we say, for an open society, although of course the heart weeps at the lumbering slowness and imprecision of the process, and the mind sees also that many problems are merely left behind and never really solved, and the spirit knows that suffering, death, and injustice, once they have happened, cannot be unhappened. Famously, the worst system, with exception, well, you know how it goes. Anyway, to push the analogy, surely the sign is the first solution to the first problem, and every subsequent instance of the scene reiterates both phases. I hope don't sound like I'm suggesting something akin to love being the answer, like some latter-day Don Draper doing a new Coke ad. If this model is to be of use in the currently rather bleak phase of the process, it will need to help us see how the present and substantial buildup of resentments might be discharged, allow us better to recognize the signs that a possibly too close to permanent occupation of the center is reaching a crisis point, and to find ways of, never mind rechanneling, maybe rewarding, reclaiming, co-opting, soothing resentments that might otherwise do all concerned a grievous harm by overwhelming the whole operation. As ever, the operation, even should we be able to judge it a success, is unlikely to be too nimble, and will certainly produce results very far from perfect. That is, resentment will continue. But continuing, I also think, is a GA thing. Despite some gloomy pronouncements from time to time, we see no apocalypses, no end days, no raptures. I say we see, I'm saying I see, of course, and hoping for the rest of us. Anyway, have I done it? Have I provoked some real heartfelt dissent, irritated impatience even? Am I fantasizing a preloaded, open, originary society?
Well, I like a lot of what you say, but yes, there's a mild rebuke at least. The problem with Popper's open society is like the problem with praise of the market as a descriptor. A truly open society with a truly open market ends up looking like sub-Saharan Africa. Being for openness or the market brushes aside the composite nature of social institutions. Nobody but mental patients really believe in the market as some absolute ruler. What constrains the market must also be there. We end up with much less dramatic and newsworthy headlines, a mixed system of freedom and constraint. Free improvisation in music doesn't mean play anything. Being for openness is like being for generalized excellence or universal fantasticness. Nobody can oppose you, but I've dragged us off course. See, you have pushed my pinker Popper button.
So it worked. Sure, such descriptors are going to raise hackles. So glad I've done that. Not for the first time, of course, as we've noted. But the claim is actually much more modest than you make it sound. I never uttered or would anything like the truly open society with a truly open market. The question merely is, what mechanisms are there to deal with rising resentment? How do they work and how effectively? Let's compare. As I said, we want the worst system as per the famous quote, with the exception of all the rest.
You're right, of course. I just wanted to fight. But there's a danger in slogans like the open society, like they're definable in a way that possessing a negative valence is. And you'll object to the music analogy, surely. I'm straw manning, aren't I?
Of course, you can't play anything. Or actually, you can, but unless it works for you or your audience, it'll mean nothing. The art of the possible that matters here is what we might call an efficient processing of feedback. Problems are problems because they trigger too much resentment and not enough love. And that is what I would say GA might add to Popper, that the fundamental problem that needs ever new solutions is that of resentment.
I like that idea. This might even be progress.
The proliferation of centers is one such answer. Let's call that a market, unless you can suggest a better, more hackle-lowering term. Because then resentment, as I'm quoting from Eric, the sentiment of exclusion from the center, end quote, can be put off for a while, as a single target no longer dominates, and one can more easily generate one's own centrality.
I'm with you, unfortunately. Unfortunately, in the sense that we're not giving the crowd here blood sport.
Well, I was going to write in that the North American ones are asleep now anyway, but that's not true. A lot of them, even from the West Coast, have come, although I don't see Eric. Well, I suspect he would have enjoyed some blood sport, but never mind.
Oh, it'll come, I'm sure. I think, Eric, and you're right that the one thing the market handles well, at least in principle, is resentment, including resentment directed at the market itself. When a merchant banker friend wears a Che t-shirt, I marvel at how capitalism can absorb resentment, including against itself. Leftists often see this as a demonic feature of the market. The demonic thing would, of course, to be banned from wearing Che t-shirts. And I'm also appreciative of the idea of exchange as an ethically more advanced system than unilateral acquisition and redistribution. I really wouldn't like my current Prime Minister, to be telling me what my music playlist for the month will look like. That's the stuff nightmares are made of. When it comes down to it, we're almost all socialists and free marketeers, no? Everything else is Twitter. But surely that's not the end of it, is it? The devil is in the policy/legal/regulatory details, no?
It's far from the end of it, yeah. And, we're still just kicking the human can down the road. I'm not for openness as a center that I vaunt over others. I'm only for less violence and for progress. You can show me another, a better way of getting there, and I'm all ears.
Well, we're not far from each other here, but the market also allows and must allow for people to proclaim its limits too. When people talk about the amazing progress capitalism has made, it's true, but we also need to see that it exists and has existed in a dialectical partnership with those things that limit it, like unions. Again, this point can only be seen in the historical details. Unions, of course, can be corrupt, stultifying, repressive, anti-competitive, indeed a vector of resentment. But that's because they're human systems run by humans. There's a fantasy on the left that if we get the system right, then we can just press go and nobody ever will be nasty. And the right is tempted to see the market in similar terms. Dostoevsky is a good antidote to both of these forms of thinking, as well as the far less cool now Solzhenitsyn's grounding of politics in the necessity of understanding concrete human existence. Sartre's critique of bourgeois ideology consists of a barrage of neologisms. Solzhenitsyn's is couched in terms of proper nouns. It's a kind of advanced plebeianism. To reassure you, I'm not about to strip naked though and learn the panpipe. I'm writing this dialogue already naked, playing the panpipe. You see, I'm always worried about politics becoming a kind of mode where there is some fantasy of absolute victory. This presumably is not just a horrifying goal, it's an unreachable one. It's a fantasy that those who don't agree with us would just get over it and stop all that whinging. It's the idea that it's them who are resentful, never us, of course, and they should just move on. Why are you raining on Bezos's genius, they say? Let the man do whatever he wants, just because you don't own a space jet. Just admit you want one.
I'm afraid I'm past the point where stripping naked would feel at all emancipatory, at least in most contexts. Learning to play the panpipe, maybe that's not out of reach. Space jets, total non-starter, even as a fantasy. When there are so many desires around, one can turn a cold shoulder to more of them.
Well, there goes my Christmas present idea for you.
Anyway, a couple of things. I've written in the past about the operation of alliances or partnerships. I don't contrast the world of a single sacred public center with an absolutely atomized individualism. In what we are broadly calling market society, people make many kinds of alliances, by which I just mean arrangements where there is a differential between the rivalry within the alliance and that with the outer human world. Families are an example, companies, nations, trading blocs, scholarly societies, and unions. They are all features of the market world as I understand it. Every such alliance has to be judged by its pragmatic value for those within or the risks to those outside. That's partly what politics is for. And second, I quite agree with you about the fantasy of absolute victory. I think this is basically why I'm a Gansian and not a Girardian or various other things. It's a perfect example of an unattainable desire to desire that the other side will just go away.
And here I'm a Gansian as well. Girard really has no politics and no aesthetics either, as Andrew Bartlett likes to insist correctly to me. Here we have to sadly agree.
The fantasy of our opponents going away is as impossible as desire, resentment, and the scene itself going away. Apocalyptical desires for some kind of purification, some sort of collective transcendence, and even through a common death, are all of an ilk. Maybe we can also sadly have to agree that when people start talking of pure this and pure that, one really needs to get worried. Human objects of desire, including those made attainable or more attainable by political processes, are, of course, always already contested, shared, imperfectly available, because desire itself is mimetic. We never get what we want, because what we want paradoxically includes what we don't want, namely the desires of other people. As Eric has said, desire is tragic. It's not that we don't always get what we want. We don't ever get what we want. We only get a bit of what we want, whether or not that can be described as what we need. The rising chorus of resentments on both sides, and let me not make any provocative claims to fearfully Girardian or Blakean symmetry. It doesn't matter if they're exactly symmetrical in intensity or plausibility. The rising chorus is a political fact, and such moralistic questions need to be set aside. The moral claims that drive resentment are always essentially the same. The point of politics is, once again, the possible, as in finding possible ways of managing or satisfying those resentments. Call it ethics. I mentioned leaving facts behind as a symptom. Of course, it's the underlying disease that actually needs treating. Still, facts are a good whose broader distribution can help soothe resentment. One can bring the fever down, and that can do good, even while one tries to heal more holistically. One should not, that is, forbear from insisting that, for example, the 2020 American presidential election was not fraudulent, or confronting the historical errors of the 1619 Project, or keeping an open mind about the increasingly uncertain origin of the COVID-19 virus.
This is a rousing speech, Ian. The problem is that people don't like this sort of deficit of melodrama when talking about politics. Your speech rouses me, as I say, but it is perhaps the problem here that real politics or effective politics is, well, boring.
Don't you find the boringness of effective politics, well, interesting? Okay, well, maybe that's not going to work. I prize competence in politicians above everything else, especially the human smarts to understand how much ground to concede to resentment, where to draw lines, how to engage not so much the better angels as the promises of non-transcendental desire that tend to help bring out people's more angelic selves, the stuff of happiness. Old boring problem. Reducing economic inequalities without killing the golden goose of the most productive of economic systems. By, for example, using the tax code instead of sacking the chateau, eliminating tax cheating instead of raising tax levels to confiscatory levels, targeted, sensible redistribution, learning from the results of previous attempts, defended ethically but accompanied with toned down moralism. Just me maybe, but I really have no patience for moralistic politicians. Usually they're just trading in resentment. So yes, to me, the woke moralism that castigates the entire body politic except itself is very unhelpful. Leave aside whether the critique is fair, although it often isn't. It leads more to the generation of personal purity, to the kind of messy, imperfect progress that I described before. And of course, it tempts reaction. But none of these points are very original. This doesn't mean big things can't be done. I think they are being done even now. And no doubt there are complicated trade-offs, specialized roles, political processes about which I am by no means qualified to speak. Maybe AOC and the woke have somehow made possible Biden and these historically large attempts to reduce economic inequality. Though I suspect we didn't really need to go through all this polarized stuff to get there. I suspect the above mentioned malcontents are more symptomatic, that is, than causal.
Excellent. So maybe we need some other ways of coming at this. And I don't just mean a different armory of terms, but different orientations. Maybe we've not even begun to think properly about some of these matters at least. I was intrigued many years ago by a book written by a philosopher who lives and works about an hour's drive from where the conference is staged here, you know. Avishai Margolitz, A Decent Society, now 25 years old, outlines what politics might look like if we looked at humiliation rather than justice as a cornerstone of politics. I do realize the ire this will create among certain people who will see in this idea just another face of the victimry, a term about which we've spoken now in this latter part little about, but which is now somehow seemingly the cornerstone of GA.
I feel one of the purposes of our dialogue here is to lay down some more stones or add a few bricks if in the other familiar metaphor. Eric, for one, has always been very hopeful that users of GA will take ownership and push the whole thing forward. If the victimary has been getting a fair amount of play time, can we, dare I put it this way, but in order to continue the construction trope, dare we build back better?
Build back better. And that sounds familiar. Is it a Canadianism with alliteration?
No, but it's the kind of thing he might have got, Biden, that is, from Canadians. I'd like to think. Anyway, I love the comparative. Nothing transcendental, just humble old better. And I'm wondering, if he takes a firm stand with China, could we even go for guns and better? Let me try to be calm. The victimary is one strategy of resentment, isn't it? We distinguish it from victimhood tout court. It attains or claims centrality by claiming that it is being or actually being excluded from centrality. As I've said and believe, resentment plays its own role in the whole process, and politics is largely the operation of dealing or trying to deal with it. I'd say politics, cultural politics, in that lumbering way I mentioned before, is in fact responding, making distinction, judging claims, playing the victim card as a recognized strategy and is assessed as such. All along the political spectrum, such claims are made and then assessed and responded to. Again, putting it this way is boring for sure. But I do think progress thereby occurs, although always 3 steps forward and 2.5 backwise. It's such a milquetoast formulation, really, and so unoriginal and generalized too. I mean, some of your earlier comments suggest, basically I'm speaking at too high a level of generality, but that's me. Because I don't know anything about the other stuff, the details. It's bad to concede that, isn't it? Well, and this is why I haven't said much up to this point about politics, and maybe I should stop. We do aspire to a decent society, but also to a just one, because justice and productivity are closely connected. Some claims to victimhood we now judge legitimate that were not so judged in earlier times. I see no magic formula or standard by which such judgments can be universally or atemporally legitimated. Arguments and appeals are made in their own historical context. On it goes. Only GA, though, with its originary distinction between the moral and the ethical, gives a satisfactory heuristic for understanding these processes, or only GA that I know of anyway. The closest thing to a workable standard that I can see is the twin GA concepts of firstness, to circle back to that, and deferred reciprocity. And incidentally, I was thinking a few moments ago that in an earlier draft, Adam, we had given you credit for the idea of firstness. As we were trying to reduce it here and there, we took you out. But Adam should always be remembered, of course, as the formulator of this the concept of firstness. Anyway, the workable standard, only workable standard I can see is the twin GA concepts of firstness, to circle back to that, and deferred reciprocity. Does a firstness, privilege, whatever you call it, end up, or soon enough end up, improving the lot and happiness of those coming second or down the line, or enough of them? One can only finally tell by the intensity and extensiveness of the resentments. And yes, those are definitely moving targets, ever rising measures. But putting down the revolution of rising expectations seems to me the most quixotic of all undertakings. Only natural catastrophe might manage it. Even Shahard sort of agreed about this, as he noted the appalling tyranny, and that's a quote from him, and I would add violence, that would accompany any effort to roll back what he was calling internal mediation. Okay, so have I been able to articulate a position of sufficiently vague hopefulness to provoke a final salvo from you before we turn it over to the whole group? Or do I need to add something provocative like, I think Steven Pinker would back me up. Don't you wish he was here?
And when I talk to you, he's like Yahweh, he's always here. But so are the other people, and they've not been able to get a word in edgeways.
Thank you for listening.
Okay, I'm willing to open it up to anyone who wants to respond. There's obviously a lot of ways getting into it. So Matthew, is that a clap? That's a clapping thing. Yeah, right. Okay, so Richard.
I see Richard.
Okay, yeah, Richard.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. That was wonderful. Nice to see you again, Chris.
Good to see you, Richard.
So, I hate to be cliche, but it seems to me that I've been watching a particularly agile wallaby or kangaroo nimbly leaping around while the humble beaver goes back to his home and plugs the original scene. This works. I built it. Watch. Of course, the kangaroo carries the home with it, so it can bounce around all the time.
It involves chewing a lot of sticks.
That's right. Chewing that.
Very careful here.
Also deforestation.
We're the originary deforesters.
If I may go back to the beginning of the dialogue, when you were talking about the big man, it seems to me that, and Adam brought this up yesterday or the day before. It seems to me that Marshall Salins has actually become more Gansian of late. So because in the 60s he talked about the original affluent society. These were the Stone Age hunter-gatherers. Not market society or or heaven forbid agrarian society. And you didn't have any real empirical data to back this up. But
is this, you talking about Stone Age economics?
Yeah. But this article that he wrote for How the original political society seems to make the reverse, almost not the reverse claim, but it makes a claim that hunter-gatherer society is very constrained by hierarchy. And so I can give you an example. Richard Lee, who spent some time among the Kung people of the Kalahari, he observed how they have this interesting ritual called insulting the meat, very colorful. But basically when a hunter makes a kill, he brings it back to the rest, or he's out there with the other hunters, and they just start mocking him relentlessly. Like, oh, well, you slipped when you threw the spear, and that's why you killed it. And it was just luck. And he basically agrees, the hunter does. Yeah, I really didn't mean to, actually. I was aiming for that one over there, and I got the big one. So he contributes to his own denigration. And Richard Lee's conclusion is that this is to avoid precisely centralization. He even uses the term big man. They don't have big men, and they don't want any big man. But the big man, of course, this is Salins' argument later on in the original. The big man is telling them that they don't. He's up there, he's not human. He's out there in the spirit world, as it were, as Salins calls it. He's a meta person who tells them that they have to follow these kind of ritual regulations. So everything is extremely constrained. And so this is another way to look at the big man. It's not just that he's he gets all the women, or he gets all the money, or he gets all the goodies. It's that he's breaking an interdiction, but he's also, therefore, as I guess Ian was basically arguing the whole time, he's freeing up desire to use that word, to be productive. So I guess I don't know if this is a question, but it seems to me that the big man Marshall Salins himself seems to have come around to Gantz's position, if not literally, but in terms of his understanding of politics and hierarchy and freedom and constraint.
Yeah, I wonder if it's that, or that Eric used his research as Eric developed or articulated GA after the originary scene itself. I mean, everything that you say there seems right. And I was trying to make the point to Chris that, it's modeling that matters more than anything else. Essentially he's saying, look, you can reach for the stars to pick a game show title or something. You can reach for the stars and not get killed. You know, there are ways to do that. And you don't have to denigrate yourself. Mind you, you still have to denigrate yourself, don't you? I mean, performative modesty in politicians is crucial. And it's one of the reasons that the previous president did take some flack, right? It didn't do that part of it all that well, or all that successfully, at any rate, whether you call it well or not. But yeah, I mean,
well, your conversation, a pretty good example of that. I said your conversation was in the interactive situation of face-to-face conversation. We always make these self-humiliating gestures. That's the idea of a joke.
Yeah, well, that is interesting, isn't it? That the more face-to-face you are, the more likely you are to not denigrate, but be careful. Yeah, and it's like Chris was talking about the driving accident. I mean, it's this thing, you know, mild-mannered people, like my older brother, for example, get terrible in a car, right? Because they're insulated from other people, and they do terrible stuff that he would never do, you know, on the sidewalk.
Thanks.
Anyone else want to? Marina?
Okay. Yes, I have two questions if we have time. I'm not.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, one is for Chris or everyone else, of course, as well. And you know, is there an official in GA, in Girard, you know, in Nietzsche, an official definition of resentment? Because something inside of me,
there is something like that.
Something inside of me. I thought I just got kicked out, but maybe not.
No, you're here.
You're here.
Okay. I don't know what happened. Something inside of me resists your, you know, because you're saying that if I am angry at someone, you know, who is resentful without a need, I am myself resentful. And I want to say, no, it's a different kind of feeling. It's like a righteous indignation. It's not the same as the resentment, you know. And of course, I could be wrong. I wanted to hear like why you equate these two things.
Well, no, I was saying it can be. What I'm saying is that very often the claim of other people's resentment will be in itself an expression of resentment. It's a displaced form of self-diagnosis. I mean, it's it's as adaptable as claiming oneself to be a victim is to, you know, like it's before anything else, it's a form of rhetoric. Now, Nietzsche, the way you probably think about resentment in terms of Nietzsche's work is a kind of deferred vengeance. The idea that you are not strong enough to avenge yourself against a stronger opponent, so that vengeance is turned inwards, and you find, for instance, one of your options is to find another way of claiming victory. And one way that Nietzsche said that the Christians and the Jews did, but initially the Jews, was to proclaim defeat as itself a victory, to proclaim that being defeated was itself the highest moral virtue. And he labels these womanly emotions, you know, the idea of kind of moral virtue and non-violence and all these sorts of things. And Nietzsche, of course, longed for a world in which people got over this. Of course, he got his wish in the 20th century. I don't know whether he would have been happy with it, but there was certainly a desire that we get over this kind of sickness that the Jews had given us. But I'm not saying that it is in every case. I mean, I think there's a form of an expression of anger can simply be a judgment about the injustice of a situation or someone's hypocrisy or something. And I don't think it's definitionally the case that one is that. I'm just saying that it's a much more boring case is that it can be, and that the act of accusing someone else of resentment is not always an objective description of a situation, but simply it can be another rhetorical positioning, just like claiming someone else's anger can be a displaced from one's own. It's we don't have to go into Freud to kind of show that it's true, but my claim's a more modest one, I guess.
Yeah, because it struck me that maybe I have been using the word resentment incorrectly, not according to its.
Can I jump in on this, Maria, just for a sec? It's always been a bit of a problem, it seems to me, in GA, because the word resentment doesn't feel as exalted as, for example, the passion for justice or righteousness and so on. I mean, I think we're just using it anthropologically. We're not trying to put down people who feel it, you know, and so on. And sure, there's psychologically, or for whatever reason, there's all sorts of benefits, I suppose, to you know, looking through a spectrum of different feelings and describing them. But I think that passage from Eric that I quoted, as the technical definition in GA of resentment, is the feeling of exclusion from centrality. And one feels that because one is appealing implicitly to the idea of moral equality. No one should be central. And originary resentment is of the sacred itself, you know, and so on. And then when people started occupying centers, they become automatically, as it were, objects of resentment. But a point I wanted to make when I was talking to Adam yesterday too, is that that's not the only thing you feel as you look at the center. You also feel desire.
I'll buy this definition. It makes sense to me, you know, resentment. Yeah. And my other question, and this is something I guess it's for everyone, and it's for, you know, the discussants and for Adam. You know, I realize that I don't have clarity on how firstness actually became an anthropological category. And I understand that in pragmatic terms, on every scene, someone goes first, but how does it become a constitutive concept? While with like reciprocity, you understand that it's the feature of language and the exchange of signs and so on. You know, the way I restate it for myself is that it is a kind of, you know, like when we talk about meritocracy, for example, to me, meritocracy is a kind of equality or reciprocity. You set up the rules and you say that people who possess these qualities would be eligible. And then, you know, not everyone possesses these qualities, but the ones that do, you actually equally, you give equal consideration to everyone who is qualified. But firstness is a, you know, an anthropological or a moral, you know, or is it an ethical? Maybe I'm confusing category. I don't quite understand, you know, and I mean, I use it myself, of course, but I don't quite understand how it migrates from the scene, the originary scene, where the first person took it, and it becomes like a category. I don't know if my question makes sense.
Well, maybe I should say a little bit about it.
Yeah, I was going to say, we got the inventor here, so why don't we let him speak?
Yeah, you know, this is the kind of thing. Well, Eric's not here, but you know, he can always watch the recording, I guess. There's kind of a difference between the way I use the term, and you know, I'm not going to go and ask everyone to read everything I've ever written, but if you did, you'd find that I actually use the term firstness very, very, very rarely. And have not, you know, and don't exactly treat it the way Eric tends to treat it. So there's a kind of divergence there, and I can, you know, be very kind of specific about what you know what that concept, you know, means for me when I use it. First of all, I used it originally to remedy what I saw as a defect in the originary hypothesis, which is that the originary hypothesis, as Eric had formulated it up until the time that I came across it, had seemed to assume that the originary sign was put forward simultaneously and spontaneously by everyone on the scene. And so the concept of firstness was, first of all, meant to contest that, because that didn't seem to me to make any sense. Because to assume, and it was kind of a serious issue, and I think it is, because if you imagine that everyone somehow put forward the sign at the exact same scene and at the exact same time, and all kind of recognized it as a sign at the exact same time, then you would have to imagine that there was some almost kind of instinct to do it, and you'd have to reach back to some kind of causality that couldn't be reduced to the scene. And it seemed to me that that violated the minimality and the integrity of the scene itself, that what we're looking for on the scene has to be generated only by the scene, right? There's other things going on that makes the scene possible, but if we're modeling a scene, we want to exclude everything that's not generated by the scene itself. So that was the first, that the scene had to be, in a sense, staggered. And it seemed to me that that made it a lot more interesting, because then you could start to think about, well, if someone went first, then it was kind of a tentative move, and a tentative move that would have to be followed up on by someone else, and it would be kind of uncertain for a while until it kind of caught on, in a sense, and then you would have the scene. In other words, it seemed to me to turn the originary scene into a genuine scene where something actually happens, and there's not just a kind of instant revelation. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is also kind of a difference. I never used it in the kind of economic terms that Eric ended up using it in. I never thought about it in those terms, because and I never thought about it in terms of an oscillation between firstness and reciprocity either, because firstness is firstness in reciprocity. So I didn't really see that as two things that needed to be reconciled. The other thing is, and again, you can go back and in the essay that I first wrote about this, and you could see the person who goes first. I mean, it's not a fully intentional act, right? It's not really an invention in that sense, because you can't. How could someone have been thinking, I'm going to put forward this sign and I'm going to do it in such a way that everybody else is going to follow me, right? It would have to be kind of, in a sense, half intentional, half accidental. Right? It would have to be someone kind of, whoever put forward the sign first would kind of had to sort of recognize something before everyone else. At the very least, he kind of stopped, right? And stopped in a way that was kind of showing others he was stopping, but he couldn't have really known exactly what he was doing. And he could only have come to know exactly what he was doing when he saw what he, in effect, got reflected and shown back to him by everybody else then doing it in turn, right? So the intention comes to inform the scene as a result of the scene itself. It's not like there's kind of a central director of the scene. And so in fact, it would be very difficult to point out who exactly went first. And by the time the scene is done, you couldn't have told. Everybody would kind of have done it by the end. And it would, in a sense, be forgotten. But it does seem to me that in any event, it's the same thing. I mean, it can't really be an event that just happens, everybody takes up their role spontaneously, at one time. There always has to be someone who does something, and the someone who does something is always doing it in a way that, again, you kind of know what you're doing to some extent, and you don't know what you're doing to another extent. You find out what you're doing by kind of seeing what everybody else is doing as a result. And that's why it seemed to me that, the best way to think about it is to take up this other, this analysis of Eric's from, the origin of language, of the generation of the successive speech acts, right? Because if you follow the way in which the imperative and then the interrogative and the declarative sort of emerge, they all emerge in that same way. And I kind of had that in mind. I don't remember how completely I had that in mind, but I had that in mind in formulating this. So it's not like someone thought, I'm going to start ordering people around, and therefore he invented the imperative. Because again, the point is, you couldn't have done that before there was an imperative. You couldn't have thought to yourself, I want to issue an imperative. The whole problem is to account for the emergence of something that doesn't exist, and therefore no one could have thought of it, right? So it becomes the imperative through what Eric calls the inappropriate ostensive. And then someone, names an object when it's not there, and someone else wants to kind of keep the scene intact, right? And so they go and get it, right? And bring it. And now you have a new speech form. Now you can kind of name something and someone goes and gets it, right? So now you have an imperative, right? That follows from an ostensive, right? But again, the first person who gave the imperative wasn't trying to invent that, right? So it seems to me that this provides a much more helpful model of kind of cultural production and cultural and generation and reciprocity and so on. If we keep in mind that, again, all the things that Chris was talking about, this, this whole problem of claiming firstness and so on, in a certain sense, if you keep looking at it closely enough, it only really becomes first in the aftermath, and only in some way that the person who went first didn't really quite mean it to be first. Again, it's not totally an accident, right? Somehow it's kind of traced back to something someone did that others saw, right? They had to see it to pick up on it. So, I mean, in that case, it seems to me that the concept, is already kind of embedded. It's embedded in reciprocity, and it's already less kind of self-aggrandizing to say that someone went first, and it enables you to get into the complexities. And so, yeah, I mean, the ancient Hebrews, in a sense, they came up with something, and it does get very complicated. I'm getting very interested in this right now. There's some really fantastic studies going on right now about the emergence of ancient Israelite monotheism and so on, and it's getting very, very sophisticated and very, very interesting. And you could see, yeah, there's something that some few people picked up on here, but again, what it turned out to be was not exactly what they would have thought they were doing in the 6th century, BC or whenever, right? So, so maybe that helps to, to kind of frame things a bit differently.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. I don't know, Maureen, if you wanted to come back, but I was going to say, but I love that phrase, and surely this is true of all sorts of innovations, changes, things that get invented is a half intentional. But it is that half that is the crucial thing, surely, and I quite like the point, because it was, again, referring back to something that we were talking about yesterday a little bit, is that, yeah, it's forgotten, right? So that perhaps most greatest genius of human history, who started humanity, is immediately forgotten, is lost in time, is lost in the past, because once everyone's pointed, then they're not paying attention to each other anymore, let alone who did it first. They're only paying attention to the center.
I mean, I am interested, though, in the way the term, because I guess that's really interesting, Adam, and fantastic to have that context there. I'm interested, though, in the way the language itself gets deployed, because we're already far from Persian semiotics, where we get it from, and then Eric's using it differently. And often does come out to a kind of claim of, even what you said is a kind of claim of victory, in a sense. What's your relation to that use of the term? Is that seems to me to be one of the deployments of it, that within the context of GA, it becomes a version of a better than, or bigger than, faster than, stronger than kind of discourse, and the way you've put it then, it's completely disconnected from anything. Like, we've never made a claim like that, but of course there is that association sometimes. Is that a misapplication of the term, or is it a?
Well, yeah, I mean, to some extent, yeah. I mean, I have some differences from Eric in terms of using. Like I said, I very rarely use it, but there's this concept, and I use this in another context. This concept of Girard's of the was it the text of persecution, and I think it it implies that we kind of impose a sort of standard on ourselves, that if we're going to talk about resentment towards firstness or something like that, or we're going to talk about firstness, then we're going to you want to look for it in a text, okay, and you want to be able to show how it's actually working in things that people are saying and doing, right? And you want to point it out. And I'll give one small example. Again, if you read Eric and mine, the book, it's mostly his, but I obviously have my contribution as well to, to the book on anti-Semitism. One thing, this idea of that anti-Semitism is resentment towards Jewish firstness, and I know that was one of the things that you were kind of getting at in various ways there, Chris. That's in a sense that creates problems for me as well, because then you have this question: why would someone in 2020 or 2021 be resentful of some people who may or may not have invented this particular notion of God, 2,500 years ago, who may or may not have something to do with the people today who happen to be called Jews and so on. And yeah, all of the routes getting from one to the other is obviously very, very, very complicated. But I have to say one thing that I noticed, and again, this is something I don't even write about anymore. I kind of, I've sort of relegated this to very secondary interest of mine, if not tertiary interest. But one thing that I noticed is in certain kinds of arguments today, that we could call anti-Semitic. I don't even want to call things anti-Semitic and racist and anything, unless someone claims it for themselves already. This goes back to this question of resentment, right? Of kind of accusing someone of resentment, and like, how do we distinguish resentment from righteous indignation and so on, because it does. I take Ian's point that it's kind of an anthropological designation, but at the same time, it is resentment, right? And resentment kind of does have its own definition, and it's not a kind of complementary one, right? So I kind of have really moved very strongly away from making these kinds of charges, right? But one thing that I did notice is that you could see one kind of trope within, again, what we could call anti-Semitism, because here we're dealing with people who they would call themselves as critics of Jews or whatever. So fine, we can call it that then, is that there's this kind of move that the Jews in Israel do for themselves what they won't let us do in America, right? So the most obvious kind of thing is, so Israeli Jews restrict immigration, right? But American Jews are in the vanguard of promoting more immigration, right? So this kind of, in a sense, I could see how resentment of firstness is, it could be a kind of helpful description here, because it's like in criticizing the Jews, you're taking Jews as the model for what you would really want to do and should be able to do, but the Jews are not letting you do. So it seems to me with those kinds of formulations, then I think the analysis works. But that's the point. You need to show that there's that kind of formulation, and that there's that kind of logic to it. And sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't, and you have to pursue the analysis in a different way.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah. The other kind of firstness, I guess, that Eric talks about in one of the most amazing phrases he's ever come up with is Holocaust envy. In that sense of the form of anti-Semitism which arrives through the envy of a victimary claim, the historical impact, which you could look at in secondary ways, like the Godwin's law, that every argument on the internet will, through a certain series of processes, arrive at Hitler. And the idea of that there's a certain kind of anti-Semitism promoted by the fact that the ultimate victimary claim comes via the Holocaust, and there's a kind of Jewish firstness in that moral reorientation.
Yeah, the way to deal with this stuff, I think, is we need kind of a. One thing that I want to say is Chris's argument was really again it was really directed at kind of I can almost list the chronicles that each of your claims was directed at. So I've had my own critique of Eric's politics, which come from a very different direction and so on. So one thing that I want to say is, if more people in GA wrote about politics, then and kind of made these kinds of analyses and counter analyses, then the whole field would look different. Then it wouldn't be then kind of Eric's specific politics wouldn't be GA politics, and we wouldn't have to argue about whether this is GA politics and so on. And that really hasn't happened yet. And I've been hoping it would happen for a long time. So that's one thing. But the whole thing with the Holocaust really in a sense, created the whole legal and political foundation for the post-war order.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and you have to kind of look at it at that level, right? And you know, and yes, then the Jews become kind of the central victims in that order, and then everyone who wants to claim, you know, some kind of victim position after that has to model themselves on the Jews for very kind of, you know, specifically legal reasons, right? I mean, the whole, you know, the whole post-Nuremberg legal order. I mean, this is, you know, it would be great to do a GA analysis of that because it's extremely important. That what that actually did is it made the claim that other states can take an interest in the citizens of other states. And so the whole post-war human rights legal order follows from that, and American civil rights to a great extent follows from that. So all of this stuff follows from that. And you could see very early on that in order to make a kind of victimary claim, you had to sort of, either you have to kind of link yourself to the, you know, well, as Eric says, the Nazi Jew, right? That the Nazi Jew, you know, dichotomy has to become the model for whatever you want to do. It was just the most politically, you know, expedient and obvious way to do things. And so that certainly set up one particular trajectory.
Yeah,
You know,
I'm not sure that you can think about the necessarily it leads from the legal, because as we know, international law's never been, it has no teeth, right? Even now, like it's a, and so maybe the cultural import's been better. I guess maybe another way of looking at it. The other way of seeing it is the last phase of modern desacralization, after you've done the church and you've done you know, the certain kind of religious desacralizations. Then in the Second World War, you have a kind of desacralization of the nation state as a kind of sacred entity in which people can do anything to their own citizens. But it's a really interesting. It is a really interesting way of reframing what what's Eric's called the Nazi Jew dichotomy, where that becomes a kind of model in which any form of oppression will tend, given a certain number of moves. But that's really, right. And I agree also about
for legal and institutional reasons, right? Which we really need to learn to speak more about in GA, right? That anytime we want to talk about resentment and desire, it's mediated by these very kind of, you know, large scale, heavily funded, heavily defended institutions, where there's tons of money, where there's people with actual power doing all kinds of things, right? And you could say international law has no teeth, but international human rights law has done a lot. Okay, I mean, it's overthrown a lot of governments. It kind of sets up the UN. It sets up lots of human rights groups that go into all kinds of other countries and generate resentment and antagonism towards towards governments that are hostile to other governments and so on. So that becomes a vehicle of what we could call American global politics. Maybe not only American, but primarily American global politics.
Sure, no, I accept that. Yeah, I was coming at it from a slightly different angle in terms of the international prosecution of war crimes. But you're right at that. You're absolutely right at that, more or at the local level and the kind of institutions that.
And we GA. I guess defense is GA is in its infancy, and we're mostly literary critics, and I'm kind of, I guess, an autodidact in some of this stuff, and the more of the more people over the years that use GA and apply them to these things, then I think these that kind of having to define your politics against one seemingly central GA politics hopefully will get kind of diffused.
I might say that was kind of what we're trying to do today, or at least get it rolling in that direction.
Yeah, Andrew, maybe one last question before we have to.
Yeah, we have like 1 minute left.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just, I was always uncomfortable with the Firstness Amendment. I'm sure, Adam, you're thick-skinned enough not to really care. So, and the reason for it is that for me, the center comes first. I tend to interpret the originary scene, the originary event theologically. And if the whole God invents man, man invents God, if the little slash mark there is in fact minimal, and we're sincere about both sides as practitioners of GA, and we're not just pseudo respectful of theism, if it really invests in anything at all that would enable respect for theists who believe in a created universe as opposed to an uncreated universe, or a universe that is open to something other than the closed universe of scientific naturalism, then the center comes first. The center comes first. And what's troubled me about the amendment from the beginning is that it splits the attention of participants in the originary event. And just to wrap it up, but it splits the attention between the human and the divine. You know, your attention is now divided between the sacred, divine, inaccessible, inviolable, infinitely desirable center, and some pots on the periphery who happens to make the first sign. And I don't care who went first in terms of the humans on the periphery. I don't care. I really don't care. Because whoever went first, it doesn't effing matter, because the sign doesn't take until the sign is shared. And the sign is shared because it is the sign of the center, from the center, to the center, mediated by the center. And so this moral equality, if it is to have any purchase at all in terms of the real, small r or capital R, has to defer to the sacred center. And the sacred center has to be something other than a nominalist invention of the human. It has to be real, anthropologically. And so I'll just stop there. And then actually I won't, because when it gets transferred into an economic metaphor, it's absolutely grotesque. Because then, you know, well, Bill Gates went first, and so you have no moral grounds at all, none, to speak about inequalities of wealth. Let's just take the prophets out of the Old Testament, or the scriptures. Oh, what these fucking resentful prophets. We don't need to listen to them. No, when they're screaming about widows and orphans, we have to listen to them. And Jeff Bezos has to answer to them. Otherwise, what are we talking about the Judeo-Christian heritage for, or the preciousness of Western civilization? You know, so the way in which Firstness levers a kind of market fundamentalism in GA is just absolutely grotesque from my point of view. And I'm not saying Adam is responsible for anything or Eric is responsible for anything. Adam, you're absolutely right that I'm too lazy or timid or whatever to articulate these things over the years, but I just thought I'd get this onto the recording for today. And the political theology, I mean, I think maybe GA needs a political theology that allows it to be, something other than a kind of, I don't know, weird, at least, anyway, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to see that. And the only thing I'll say is that someone would have to do it.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
And whoever that is would have to be, in a sense, first in doing it.
Yeah.
So, okay, so maybe we'll end it there, because we did go 1 minute over when we ran through our break, but who wants a break, really? So let's...
I'm very glad we had this discussion. Thank you, everyone. That was, I think we have leaped forward in some way.
Not the great leap forward, hopefully, but yes.
Not a great leap.
Yeah. Thanks so much. It's so good to see you all. Apart, this is more sentimental. It was really good to see you all as well. So, yeah.
You too.
Nice
Right,
talking to you. Let's take 5 minutes break.
Okay.
5 minutes, all right?
Link, it's 1 in the morning here. If I can't sleep, is it the same link?